My name is Lindy Mtongana, and it is my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. I'm a journalist based in Nairobi, Kenya, and also the host of one of the Global Initiative's podcasts called Africa and the Global Illicit Economy. To begin with, let me start with explaining what the Global Initiative is. Now, as some of you may very well know, the GI is an independent organization working on the front lines of the fight against the illicit economy and criminal actors through a network of global civil society observatories that is essentially made up of civil society actors, journalists, and researchers. The GI is able to monitor evolving trends and work towards building the evidence bases for policy action and holistic responses to a range of crime types. Through the GI's Resilience Fund, the organization is able to support community activists and local NGOs who work in areas where crime governance is critically undermining people's safety, security, and livelihoods. Well, today, the Global Initiative is launching a new report. It's called Changing Tides, the Evolving Illicit Drug Trade in the Western Indian Ocean. The report is the culmination of research conducted by the GI's Civil Society Observatory of Illicit Economies in Eastern and Southern Africa. And of course, this report documents how drug markets are expanding and diversifying in the Western Indian Ocean islands and the impact this is having, particularly with regards to corruption and domestic consumption of drugs. The report's authors are our panelists today. They are Lucia Bird, Julia Stanyard, Vel Moonien, and Rihanna Raymond Radriana Resoa. Just a few matters of housekeeping. If you have just joined us, remember you can follow today's proceedings in either English or French. Go down to the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select the language that you would prefer to follow today's conversation in. You can also mute the original audio. That might just make for a better listening experience. Now, the GI is recording today's webinar for its own purposes, and at a later stage, a copy of this webinar will be posted on YouTube. The conversation is also taking place on Twitter, so feel free to engage on that platform. You can find the GI's Twitter page by going to its handle. That's at GI_TOC. Again, a reminder, please keep your video off and stay on mute throughout the proceedings of today's webinar. We will have a Q&A session later that will be conducted via the chat box. So you will write your questions into that chat box, indicate who you would like to answer those questions, and I will ask those questions on your behalf when we get to that Q&A session. Right, let's get into today's program. I'll give a little bit of background into the report. I'll then introduce our panel of speakers. They will then give us their presentations, and then we will go into that Q&A session at the very end of today's webinar. So the islands of the Western Indian Ocean, namely Mauritius, the Seychelles, Madagascar, the Union of the Comores, and the French overseas territories of Mayotte and Réunion, have been drastically impacted by illicit drug markets. The islands are particularly vulnerable because of their proximity to a major heroin trafficking route, that's the southern route, and growing regional methamphetamine and cocaine routes. So what started as a spillover effect has essentially bred a market for local consumption. The region is now home to drug markets that include heroin, synthetic cannabinoids, cocaine, and cannabis, and even the growing volumes of heroin that are being transported through Madagascar are turning this particular country into a hub for trafficking routes. So Changing Tides, this new report documents these significant changes underway, and it pays attention to some of the drastic impacts that this burgeoning drug market is having. And that includes widespread corruption, state complicity with drug markets, financial flows, and a range of others. Let's now go straight into introducing you to our speakers. We are joined by Vel Moonien. He has a long and prolific career in investigative journalism in Mauritius, which includes years of reporting on police affairs, such as investigations relating to drugs. He's also been the co-editor-in-chief of L'Express, a daily newspaper, and pure player at ION News. He's worked as a correspondent for Le Monde and the Quotidien de la Réunion and gCaptain, an American news site. Currently, Vel is the head of news and investigations at the Défi Media Group, which is the largest press group in Mauritius. From Madagascar, we are joined by Rihanna Raymond Randriana Risoa, who is an investigative journalist. She is one of the founders, as well as the general secretary of the Madagascar Network of Investigative Journalists. She is an activist for press freedom in her country and a promoter of investigative journalism. Rihanna is also a recipient of the GI's Resilience Fund Fellowship for 2021. Now, from the Global Initiative, we are joined by Lucia Bird, a senior analyst whose work focuses on human trafficking and smuggling, drug trafficking, and cybercrime. Previously, Lucia worked as a legal and policy advisor to governments in Ghana and Pakistan. And we're also joined by Julia Stanyard, who is an analyst for the Global Initiative's Observatory for East and Southern Africa. She works on editing the risk bulletin for that observatory, and her research is focused on drug trafficking, drug policy, and trafficking in cultural property. So without any further ado, I'd like to call on Lucia Bird and Julia Stanyard to begin with their presentations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lindy, for the kind introduction. Claudio, if we can have the slides, please. So the islands of the Western Indian Ocean have been drastically impacted by drug markets. And in this presentation, we'll explore the inter-island drug ecosystem and highlight some of the key findings of our research. Particularly since 2015, greater volumes and range of drugs are being trafficked to and through the Western Indian Ocean islands. Claudio, next slide, please. And Mauritius and the Seychelles operate as the key consumption markets in this inter-island ecosystem. The two islands are rendered particularly attractive to drugs trafficking networks because of their comparative wealth. And so we can contrast the spillover effect tracked in transit countries elsewhere, including in the African mainland, to the dynamics on these two islands, which, partly vulnerable due to proximity to the trafficking route, have also been specifically targeted as consumption markets in their own right. And demand, particularly for heroin in Mauritius and the Seychelles, has been one factor shaping the emergence of Madagascar as a key transit point for regional drug trafficking routes. In this presentation, we'll outline each of the major drugs markets in the inter-island drugs trafficking ecosystem, drawing on data from pricing surveys conducted with people who use drugs as part of the research. One note before we leap in, we did not focus on methamphetamines as part of this research, although GI-TOC research in 2020 identified that Afghan-produced meth is being trafficked alongside heroin on the southern route. In the Seychelles, health authorities have recently detected meth use for the first time, and people who use drugs reported that meth is increasingly available. This is something that requires further scrutiny across the islands, but is not something that we explored in depth as part of this research. After looking at each of the key drugs markets in turn, our co-authors Vel and Rihanna will explore the market characteristics of Mauritius and Madagascar in greater depth before we turn to look at impacts, responses, and recommendations. So, next slide, please. Looking first at the heroin market. Bar cannabis, this is the region's most long-standing and prominent drugs market. The Seychelles is estimated to have the highest opiate consumption rates in the world, and Mauritius is not far behind. The heroin market in Mauritius has long roots in its history, reaching back to the mid-1970s. In contrast, heroin consumption in the Seychelles is more recent and occurred in parallel to the expansion of the southern route from the late 1990s and early 2000s. But the growth of the market was steep, A study by APDAR, the Seychelles Agency for the Prevention of Drug Abuse and Rehabilitation, tracked a four-fold increase in the number of heroin users between 2011 and 2018. And further studies since then suggest that consumption has continued to increase. Heroin is predominantly trafficked into and through the islands by sea. There's a significant flow onto the eastern southern African coastline and then back out to the island states. There are also reports of dhows and bulk carriers en route to the mainland coastline, offloading a proportion of heroin shipments in the Seychelles EEZ, which is then picked up by smaller boats and landed in the Seychelles. Similar dynamics were reported by some interviewees in relation to Madagascar, suggesting that there may be a more direct route to these two islands. The size of seizures in Mauritius and the Seychelles have driven speculation that the islands could be transit points in international trafficking flows. Interviewees in our research did not agree with this, and instead the islands were perceived as end markets, and we didn't find evidence of this transit role in our research. However, a recent spate of large seizures in Mauritius, which Vel will explore later on, does once again raise this question, and it's something we are keeping an eye on. What is clear is that Madagascar operates as a key transshipment point, a repackaging and redistribution hub in the inter-island drugs economy, and particularly for heroin trafficking. Interviewees both inside and outside Madagascar consistently reported that heroin trafficking through the country has grown significantly over the past 5 years, with domestic consumption, particularly in urban centres, including the capital, and also Helville, the main town in the northeastern island of Nosy Bay, which is also an important maritime heroin export point, increasing in parallel to this over the last 5 years. And Madagascar was repeatedly cited as a key point of import for heroin into Mauritius and the Seychelles. Given the scarce resources available to address the growing drugs market in Madagascar, this is a key point of concern. In contrast, Réunion and Mayotte were not found to play a significant role in the inter-island heroin markets. Turning to price, and we have some of our pricing data here on the slide in the graph. As you can see, the prices varied significantly between the islands, and it's notable that the average price of heroin in Mauritius is at over 100 euros or over 5,000 Mauritius rupees, is over double the price of heroin in the Seychelles. In the Seychelles, heroin prices have been dropping since 2015 and particularly since 2018. Again, the price is materially lower in Madagascar, which supports our understanding of the island operating primarily as a transit country. Next slide, please, Julia.
Thanks very much, Lucia, and thank you to everyone for joining this afternoon. I hope everyone can hear me clearly. So to move on from the heroin flows that Lucia has just discussed to cocaine, the headline finding really is that the cocaine market is far smaller than the heroin market in the Indian Ocean Islands, both for domestic consumption and for trafficking transit through the region. Despite being much smaller, however, we would highlight that domestic consumption is growing significantly. That's what was highlighted to us by interviews with people who use drugs, particularly in the case of the Seychelles and Réunion. So it's dwarfed in comparison to heroin as the largest and most established illicit drugs flow, but something perhaps to watch. People who use drugs in the Seychelles, for example, reported that cocaine first widely became available to them in late 2019, particularly in the form of crack, and has been on the rise since then. And we'd say that this rise does have a global context, in that globally there's been seen record-breaking levels of cocaine production around the world in recent years. The UN World Drug Report for 2020 recorded cocaine and heroin production among the highest levels in modern times. And according to estimates from the United States, combined production for Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru, the three largest producers of cocaine globally, has more than doubled between 2013 and 2018. So while this region is far from those production hubs, we're seeing these impacts, we think, here. There's also been increasing large-scale transit of cocaine through Southern Africa. There have been larger seizures recorded in South Africa and coming from South Africa via production regions to other parts of the world, which have been seen in recent years. And we think that this has had an impact on secondary flows as seen to the island states here. As you can see on the map, in the slide shown here. There's a mixture of air trafficking and maritime trafficking routes for cocaine in the region, by air mostly reported by mules, and by sea mainly container vessels, which contrasts to heroin, which while there is container traffic for heroin in the region, also smaller fishing vessels such as dhows do play a really prominent role, which isn't the case for cocaine. As the map highlights, we've also seen Madagascar growing as a transit point for cocaine, going on to the other island states and elsewhere, as highlighted. One particular anomaly would highlight here, well, anomaly, slightly different situation to the other island states here is Réunion. And interviewees that we spoke to reported that cocaine imports are actually coming more from mainland France via air. And seeing as Réunion is in French overseas territory and has close economic and social ties to mainland France, that is perhaps what lies behind that trend. But this differs to the other islands where traffic by air either comes via mainland Africa or maritime routes also coming via East and Southern Africa as well. Moving on to our price data for cocaine, as you can see on the graph, the prices reported for here far outstrip those that were seen for any other drug type that we recorded, such as heroin. This could reflect the fact that cocaine is a relatively new or relatively niche market in the islands compared to heroin, which, as Lucia has been through, has a much longer history and kind of lacks a wide consumer base at this point. So people who use drugs reported that some of them are currently priced out of the cocaine market because the prices are so high. Give an example, in Réunion, prices are double that which is reported in Paris, even though that's where the dominant supply chain going into Réunion is. And this is despite it being lower purity than is often reported in Europe as well. We have comparatively lower prices reported in Madagascar compared to the other islands such as Seychelles and Mauritius, which perhaps reflects the relative buying power of the average Malagasy cocaine consumer, as well as Madagascar being a transit point for the other islands. So one thing we would highlight here really is that cocaine might be a sort of newcomer in the region compared to heroin, but these are established trafficking networks diversifying into this new market, as the prices show, is highly profitable. So one we would foresee to rise in the future. Thanks very much. Pass to Lucia.
Next slide, please. So turning to new psychoactive substances, really it's synthetic cannabinoid compounds known as chimiques, meaning chemicals, which are by far the most significant NPS market across the islands. These first emerged between 2011 and 2013, and by 2015 consumption had surged in Mayotte and Mauritius, and by 2018 had increased significantly in the Comores, creating significant disruption to and expansion of the drugs markets across these islands. In fact, our research in 2020 found that synthetic cannabinoids were the most commonly used drug in Mauritius and Mayotte, with the exception of cannabis. The speed of expansion of this synthetic cannabinoid market is partly due to the nature of the market and supply chain. The chemicals are easily purchased online on the surface web and imported predominantly by post from China. Testing by the Mauritius Forensic Science Laboratory found that 95% of tested compounds in Mauritius originated from China. Now, for this market, there's no need for connections really with overseas suppliers, like, for example, are required in the heroin and cocaine markets, because they can just be purchased online. And once imported, there's no complex manufacturing process, keeping the cost of production low and profits extremely high. So the market has very low barriers to entry, and it triggered a spate of new entrants into the drugs markets in Mayotte, where it essentially created a drugs problem where none had previously existed, and also in Mauritius. In Mauritius, of course, there was already a well-established drugs market, particularly centered around heroin, and interviewees noted that the entrance of the synthetic cannabinoids democratized the market. So many networks were created in parallel to existing structures which had been built around the heroin profits, triggering a significant fragmentation and expansion of the market. In contrast, use appears low in the Seychelles and Réunion and was not reported in Madagascar. However, the speed at which the market grows once it gains traction and the significant public health impacts means that this is a key threat to keep an eye on. In terms of prices, in contrast to heroin, where the prices in Mauritius outstrip those on the other islands, synthetic cannabinoids are cheap in Mauritius, and also the prices were of notable consistency. There was no variation in prices quoted by different people who use drugs across the island, unlike the other drugs. While in Mayotte and in Mauritius, synthetic cannabinoids were viewed as affordable, in the Comores, which also has extensive use, they were seen as quite expensive. Next slide, please, Julia.
Thanks, Lucia. So moving on to cannabis flows, the headline really with cannabis is that it is in some ways the region's most long-standing drugs market, in that it has been grown and used in the Indian Ocean island region for many decades, if not longer, and is the only drug that is produced in the region. Obviously, Lucia has touched on synthetic cannabinoids, that the precursors for those can be purchased easily and mixed, but cannabis is the only plant-based drug which is produced in the island states. It does remain uniformly criminalized across the island, even as other countries in East and Southern Africa have shifted policy on this. Obviously, you can refer to the court case leading to legalization for personal use in South Africa, and several countries in Eastern Africa have moved to capitalize on the global booming cannabis production market for medicinal purposes, such as Lesotho, for example. But we haven't seen that trend emerge in the island states. Approval of cannabis for medical use has passed in the Seychelles quite recently, but this does not extend to production. Some key trends that would highlight here from our findings, as shown on the map, cannabis production has really boomed in Madagascar in recent years, and it does export cannabis regionally. There are production areas that we've marked on the map here in the north, in Analabe and Banja, and in the south in Batroka, which Rihanna will speak on at greater length later in the event. And while the vast majority of cannabis that is grown in Madagascar is consumed domestically, it is very widely used, it is also exported as shown to the other neighbouring islands, including the Comores and particularly Mauritius. Cannabis production in these regions, which are rural and quite remote, it offers a kind of opportunity for livelihood for communities in those areas, as it is a very lucrative cash crop. Rihanna will go into in more detail, but we would just highlight that the way that cannabis trafficking groups are entrenched in these areas to move cannabis out of the growth and production zones is really quite different to any sort of dynamic that we've seen for other drug markets in the region. The destination for Malagasy grown cannabis is primarily Mauritius and the Comores, as noted, but also further afield to the Seychelles. The second major trend that we'd want to highlight here, as shown on the pricing graph, is that prices in Mauritius for cannabis really outstrip anything that is seen across the other island states. Seen in Madagascar, for example, as a major producer, prices for cannabis are extremely low. But prices in Mauritius have increased almost fourfold between 2015 and 2020, to the point at which it's almost a luxury good and not a kind of widely affordable form of drug. So this was attributed by people we spoke to in Mauritius for this research to significant eradication efforts for the cultivation of cannabis in Mauritius. And so this has led to a shift to reliance on imports, including from Madagascar. This was also linked in a way to the surge in synthetic cannabinoid use, which has been seen in Mauritius as well, as it was reported that as cannabis prices have grown, the use of synthetic cannabinoids became a cheaper alternative to the ever rising cannabis prices. This also spurred imports from Réunion into Mauritius, which we'd highlight as it's the only instance in which we've seen Réunion operating as a drugs exporter rather than as a destination market. Now we've been through the drug by drug findings, I would like to pass over to Vel and Rihanna, who will look specifically at Madagascar and Mauritius and take the political economy of the drug markets in their entirety into account.
Thank you so much to Julia Stanyard and Lucia Bird for that very informative overview of the illicit drug markets in the Western Indian Ocean. I think that really just covers all the trends that are taking place as far as flows, pricing, volume, and diversity of drugs, all underway, all at play in this particular region. Let's now zoom in on the islands. Of course, as Julia just said, let's zoom in on Mauritius and Madagascar, starting in Mauritius with Vel Moonien. Over to you, Vel.
Oui, merci Lindy. Claudio, s'il vous plaît, le slide. Donc, comme vous le savez, à l'évocation de l'île Maurice, il y en a beaucoup parmi vous, j'en suis certain, surtout avec le confinement sanitaire qui avait en tête les plages de sable blanc et les lagons translucides. Oui, c'est vrai, le pays qui figure parmi les économies les plus dynamiques d'Afrique est un paradis sur terre, mais il est aussi malheureusement pour les trafiquants de drogue en tout genre. Malgré la Covid-19 qui a amené à la fermeture des frontières et deux couvre-feux successifs, le trafic de drogue ne s'est jamais porté aussi bien. Récemment, il y a exactement un mois et un jour, on a assisté à la saisie record de 243,4 kg d'héroïne d'une valeur marchande de 3,6 milliards de roupies, soit près de 75 millions d'euros au nord de l'île. Un patron de pêche a été arrêté par la brigade antidrogue relativement à ce stock, car soupçonné d'avoir aussi introduit 26 kg de hashish d'une valeur de 78 millions de roupies, ce qui nous fait 1,6 million d'euros. Donc, les soupçons, c'est que ce monsieur aurait utilisé sa flotte de bateaux pour amener de la drogue, soit de Madagascar, soit des bandes de pêche dans la région des Comores et d'Agalega, etc. Cette affaire remet sur les tapis la thèse que les frontières maritimes mauriciennes sont particulièrement poreuses. Si vous êtes de ceux qui suivaient ce dossier depuis longtemps, il y a eu des rapports qui ont été déclassés par la CIA qui, depuis les années 80, indiquent que des yachts, des bateaux de plaisance des Seychelles et des alentours qui introduisent de la drogue sur les territoires mauriciens. On a assisté à un phénomène nouveau à Maurice, c'est que nombre de trafiquants disposent de vedettes rapides, des go-force, comme vous dites peut-être chez vous, qui sont chargés de ramener de la drogue de Madagascar, de l'île de la Réunion ou des bancs de pêche. En octobre 2018, par exemple, la brigade antidrogue mauricienne a intercepté un ex-trafiquant de drogue avec 110 kg d'héroïne d'une valeur de 1,6 milliard de roupies au nord de l'île. Il revenait supposément du banc de Soudan. Et les saisies, ça se multiplie. Chaque 2-3 mois, vous avez des grosses saisies sur des bateaux en provenance de Madagascar, de l'Afrique du Sud. Si vous suivez l'actualité mauricienne, vous allez voir que si ce n'est pas de l'Afrique du Sud, ça nous vient de Madagascar, qui, comme Julia et Lucien nous disaient, vient du hub qu'est Madagascar. Le trafic de drogue par voie maritime semble être très bien organisé. Et on a vu avec les récentes arrestations, il semble que les réseaux de trafiquants ont infiltré la douane, la police, la poste et d'autres secteurs pouvant servir à l'importation de drogues, telles par exemple dans les sociétés de courrier express. Récemment, on a vu un bateau qui revenait de Madagascar qui nous a ramené quelques 2 kilos d'héroïne. Et c'était ce même navire qui nous a ramené le dernier record de drogue, c'était 119 kilos d'héroïne d'Afrique du Sud, qui était dissimulée dans des sableuses à pression. Par rapport aux différentes saisies qu'on a assistées ici, quand un stock de drogue arrive à Maurice, disons sur un bateau, cela signifie qu'il y a assurément des complices au port. Il y a des dockers qui sont chargés d'exfiltrer la drogue hors de l'enceinte portuaire. L'année dernière, en plein confinement, nous avions un transporteur de bétail qui revenait d'Afrique du Sud, où il y avait 38 kilos de cannabis, 2 kilos de hashish et 1 kilo de la même drogue sous forme de pâte qui ont été retrouvées dans la cabine d'un marin. Dans ce cas, c'est un des rares cas, ils ont pu remonter jusqu'à un docker grâce aux échanges WhatsApp de l'officier en second du navire avec celui-ci. Et récemment, les résultats ADN sont tombés et grâce aux empreintes génétiques de l'officier en second, on a pu savoir qu'effectivement, le deal a été fait en Afrique du Sud et la drogue était ramenée ici. Et il fallait que le docteur, lui, exfiltre la drogue du port pour l'écouler sur le territoire. Maurice, depuis l'époque coloniale, à l'époque, il y avait plutôt le cannabis et l'opium qui étaient présents. Mais depuis le début des années 80, on a vu le brown sugar ou l'héroïne qui ont été introduits. Et les 500 grammes de drogue qui étaient un peu le record de l'époque, ben, avec le temps, on a eu 110 kilos d'héroïne, 234,4 kilos, et ça commence à monter. Comme disait Lucia auparavant, la drogue synthétique, la chimique, comme on dit à Mayotte et à la Réunion, ben, ça a commencé l'émergence de cette drogue, ça a commencé en 2013. À 100 roupies la dose, soit près de 2 euros, elle est accessible aux collégiens, ce qui est vraiment, c'est vraiment un gros problème. Et les autorités sanitaires ont dû même ouvrir une aile spécialisée dans l'hôpital pour les traiter. Elle est vendue à chaque coin de rue et par n'importe qui. Et vous avez même des aspirants prêtres hindous qui ont été retrouvés avec. Et c'est vrai qu'il y a des questions qui se posent. Est-ce que Maurice est une plaque tournante pour le trafic de drogue? Jusqu'ici, on n'a pas eu de preuves directes, mais des questions se posent sur la saisie record de 95 kilos de cocaïne qui ont été retrouvées dans une tractopelle en provenance du Maroc en juillet 2019. Et ce stock, qui vaut 1,4 milliard de roupies, soit 35 millions d'euros, on se pose la question, est-ce qu'on a vraiment un marché à Maurice pour ce type de drogue? Parce que la cocaïne, c'est plutôt une drogue qui est consommée par les expats, par les expatriés, les touristes, etc. Donc, est-ce qu'il y a eu un problème à bord du bateau ce jour-là? Parce que le même jour, il y avait la première rame du métro qui était débarquée dans l'île. Donc, peut-être qu'ils ont paniqué, ils ont placé la drogue dans la tractopelle, parce qu'à la même période, on a eu des saisies similaires en Australie. Je peux avoir the next slide, please. Donc, pour revenir au produit le plus populaire, entre guillemets, à Maurice, c'est l'héroïne. On a eu plusieurs grosses saisies et on voit de temps en temps ces messieurs qui vont en mer et qui rapportent de la drogue. Ce qui nous fait poser la question, mais est-ce qu'il y a vraiment un véritable contrôle à Maurice? La semaine dernière, les gardes côtes ont intercepté un bateau avec 3 personnes à bord, avec 13 000 euros. D'après les soupçons, ils devaient se rendre à la Réunion pour récupérer du cannabis, qui est communément appelé le zamal là-bas. Cette semaine, le propriétaire du bateau a été arrêté. Il y a une enquête qui a été ouverte pour blanchiment. Donc, il y a beaucoup de réseaux sur la côte. Vous avez beaucoup de skippers qui vont et viennent vers la Réunion, à Madagascar, etc. Et chacun travaille de son côté. Et on a observé ici que par rapport à la grosse saisie de drogue, il y a des soupçons que ces réseaux travaillent davantage comme des coopératives où chacun contribue pour amener un gros stock et puis chacun s'occupe de son territoire particulier. Next slide, please. Donc, parmi les réseaux qu'on a identifiés à Maurice, il y a un groupe à Port-Cochon, comme vous pouvez voir sur la photo. Port-Cochon, en fait, ce nom provient d'un élevage de porcs dans un quartier qui est plutôt un bidonville, où nombre de Rodriguais. Rodrigue est une île autonome de Maurice, et vous avez beaucoup de Rodriguais qui viennent à Maurice dans l'espoir de trouver un Eldorado. Malheureusement, les trafiquants mauriciens ont commencé à, comment dire, ils utilisent cet endroit pour stocker leur drogue, pour vendre de la drogue. Récemment, nous avons vu qu'il y avait au moins une file d'attente de 50 personnes qui venaient pour s'approvisionner en héroïne, etc. En ces lieux, il y a un groupe qui s'appelle Démolition, qui est connu de la police depuis au moins 2 décennies, qui tient les ficelles de ce réseau. Il n'y a pas que ce réseau, il y en a d'autres petits réseaux qui se sont greffés autour. Et l'un des groupes qui s'appelle le Suicide Squad a été arrêté à Madagascar avec un gros stock de héroïne, de hashish et de cannabis. Donc, à travers toutes ces saisies, vous avez la commission anticorruption qui intervient de temps à autre pour essayer de démonter le réseau à travers les enquêtes pour le blanchiment, etc. Next, you have next slide, please. Donc, le problème aussi, c'est qu'il faut, comme vous voyez, il y a les arrestations qui ont été faites là-dessus durant ces dernières années. Et sur ce point, il faut savoir qu'une meilleure entente entre la police et la douane devrait permettre de mieux cerner ces trafiquants. Parce que des fois, vous apercevez que chacun se tire dans les pattes et ça n'arrange que les trafiquants de drogue. Récemment, là, il y a une semaine, il y a eu un colis de 56 millions de roupies de drogue qui est arrivé à Maurice et la douane a voulu se la jouer solo. Elle a saisi le paquet sans vraiment informer la police antidrogue et ça a résulté à une petite bagarre. Donc, avec le temps, peut-être qu'il faudrait que ces deux-là apprennent à mieux collaborer. Comme ça, on pourrait mieux traquer les trafiquants et voir quels sont les réseaux qui sont impliqués et autres. Excusez-moi. Do you have next slide, please? Ah non. Je crois que c'est tout ce qu'on a comme slide. Et le travail qui se fait à Maurice aussi, on voit que la commission antidrogue, la commission anticorruption a commencé à enquêter sur les avoirs des trafiquants. On voit que beaucoup de l'argent dérivé du trafic de drogue sont investis dans la location de voitures, par exemple, dans les fast-foods, dans l'élevage de chiens. C'est une façon de dire au fisc, voilà, nous avons vendu tel chien à tel prix, nous sommes dans un business de fast-food et autres. Et c'est comme ça que nous voyons que l'argent est disséminé dans l'économie informelle. Ouais. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention. Lindy, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Vel Moonien. Thank you. That was a very, very fascinating look at the dynamics that are at play, specifically in Mauritius. Before we get to our next speaker, I'd just like to remind you that if you would like to ask a question, you can do so by writing that into the chat box. We will get to the Q&A session towards the end of the program, but you can start writing in those questions. We have received a few already, so I'm quite excited to see what is to come in this Q&A session. Of course, before we get there, let's now bring you the perspective from Madagascar. Here is Rihanna Sora with more. Rihanna, can you hear me? It's over to you.
Yeah, oui.
Thank you.
Oui, bonjour à tous. Et donc, comme on mentionnait dans les précédentes présentations, je devrais réaliser mes interventions sur la dynamique de la filière cannabis à Madagascar et également le marché des drogues dures aux 67 hectares, c'est-à-dire en plein centre-ville, en pleine capitale de la grande île. Donc, pour commencer, est-ce qu'on peut passer à la page 3, s'il vous plaît? Oui. Donc, pourquoi le marché de cannabis se développe d'une manière vraiment très, très étonnante dans la grande île? Parce que nous avons constaté qu'en bas la baie, dans le nord du pays, comme en bas la baie dans le zone d'Anjir, dans le district de Béjouk, c'est vraiment une zone inaccessible, alors que le relief permet au développement permet donc à la culture des chanvres indiens. La deuxième raison qui favorise les trafics de cannabis à Madagascar, c'est également le fait que les médias à Madagascar ne s'intéressent pas vraiment à ce type de sujet, à l'exception donc des sujets à sensationnalisme et plutôt commercial. les zones de production de cannabis à Madagascar, nous avons constaté que ce sont des zones favorables également à la corruption, du fait de l'isolement qu'on a parlé tout à l'heure, mais également de l'absence ou de l'insuffisance des matériels pour les acteurs de lutte. Donc, c'est vraiment une faille pour Madagascar et qui permettent aux trafiquants d'agir d'une manière libre et d'une manière stable. Prochain diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Page 4. Donc, qu'est-ce qu'on a constaté dans les zones de production? Donc, c'est les trafics de cannabis à Madagascar, c'est un trafic régulier et stable, du fait qu'il a toujours des commandes, il a toujours les demandes toute l'année, malgré le fait qu'il a des périodes où il a des saisons que les productions diminuent et où la production est en hausse. Donc, c'est un marché qui existe toute l'année et ça motive également les trafiquants parce que c'est de l'argent en permanent. Malheureusement, les trafics de cannabis à Madagascar n'ont pas des retombées économiques, n'ont pas des impacts financiers positifs, surtout pour les producteurs en milieu rural. Mais par contre, c'est un business très lucratif pour les patrons et pour les dealers, c'est-à-dire ceux qui font des marchandages des produits. Et ça, cette différence entraîne des frustrations et ça entraîne également des divergences de points de vue, souvent aboutissant à des règlements de compte entre ces gens-là. Et également, ça encourage les trafiquants de drogue, surtout dans les zones de production comme Untitled Chapter, de perpétrer et de s'impliquer dans d'autres activités criminelles comme les vols de bovidés, les enlèvements, le kidnapping, qu'ils appellent bouillir dans cette partie sud de Madagascar, et également les trafics d'armes à feu. Et là, les trafics d'armes à feu, c'est vraiment dans les armes comme les fusils de chasse, non pas des armes de guerre comme les kalachnikovs ou des pistolets automatiques, du fait que ça c'est interdit. Mais cela n'empêche pas que dans d'autres zones, comme en Balapé dans le nord, selon nos informations, les témoignages collectés sur place, les trafiquants de drogue utilisent des kalachnikovs et qui tirent vraiment sur les forces de l'ordre au moment où il y a des patrouilles, où il y a des contrôles inopinés. Prochain diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Donc, comment est-ce que vous pouvez envoyer le mode opératoire? Donc, c'est tout un réseau. Les trafics de drogue à Madagascar, c'est perpétré par un réseau très puissant et des réseaux qui sont vraiment bien organisés du fait que c'est un grand système dont les éléments constitutifs ont des rôles très bien spécifiques et des rôles bien définis. Par exemple, les planteurs assurent la production et la livraison aux transporteurs et les transporteurs assurent la livraison aux grossistes ou les collecteurs et les collecteurs délivrent aux grands patrons qui sont la plupart du temps basés dans la capitale ou dans les chefs-lieux de région comme Yus pour la région de Yurumbe, Finaransu pour la région de Otumatiach et Antirapé pour la région de Vatnakarache, Analamang, c'est dans la capitale. Donc, ces gens-là, ils sont bien organisés et essayer de ne pas toucher les plates-bandes des autres. Donc, c'est vraiment bien organisé et ça rend également cela rend la difficulté de lutte par rapport aux trafiquants du fait qu'ils ont également les moyens, ils ont également donc leur stratégie de la cueillette jusqu'à la livraison et aux ventes auprès des consommateurs. Prochain diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Est-ce qu'on peut passer? Oui, voilà, pour les circuits. On a catégorisé le circuit du cannabis donc à Madagascar. C'est ce qui se passe sur les marchés locaux, donc à l'intérieur des communes ou des districts riverains des zones de production. Par exemple, pour gCaptain, c'est à l'intérieur même des districts. On voit qu'il y a les petits trafics là, entre les détaillants, c'est plus précisément les détaillants. Et pour les ventes en dehors de la région, quand on parlait tout à l'heure de Fakanakar, par exemple, on a parlé de Haute-Matière. Donc, c'est toute une organisation et avec une manière d'opérer étudiée minutieusement et avec le recrutement des acteurs, le recrutement qui se fait et qui se base surtout sur les relations entre les trafiquants d'un district à l'autre ou d'une commune à l'autre ou d'une région à l'autre. Prochaine diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Donc, les prix de cannabis à Madagascar n'est pas un prix fixe, il n'y a pas de prix fixe, mais nous avons, lors de notre étude, pendant une année sur le marché à Bichuk et dans Bans, on a pu identifier que les prix dépendent de la saison, c'est-à-dire la saison climatique qui influence la production. Par exemple, en période de pluie, même si c'est favorable pour la culture, mais c'est très mauvais pour la qualité du fait que les cannabis, il y a beaucoup d'eau et trop de feuilles. Et les prix dépendent également du nombre des commandes. Quand les trafiquants passent beaucoup de commandes, les prix diminuent du fait en guise de bonus et en guise de fidélité. Et là également, c'est suivant les clients, du fait que la fidélité d'un client auprès des paysans leur permet donc d'avoir un peu des prix révisés et prix réduits par rapport aux normes et par rapport aux autres clients qui sont par exemple des nouveaux venus dans le secteur. Prochain diapositive, s'il vous plaît. Donc, pour le monde des paiements, là, ça se passe en trois catégories. Il a le paiement en cash, c'est-à-dire que au moment de la récupération, parce que la plupart du temps, ce sont les dealers ou les collecteurs qui récupèrent les marchandises auprès des paysans. Donc c'est vraiment le paiement en cash. Et pour les mobiles transferts, il y a aussi, ça se passe entre les trafiquants, les grossistes, les patrons, passés à Tana par exemple, et les producteurs à Péchuka ou à Malapé. Ça se passe sur la question de confiance. Et il y a des échanges de services. Les échanges de services, c'est en quelque sorte les enfants des trafiquants venant de Péchouk envoient leurs enfants à Tanaris, par exemple. Et ce sont les patrons ici qui assurent la scolarisation de ces enfants et qui prend en charge les dépenses y afférentes. Donc, si c'est comment fonctionnent les trafiquants dans la filière drogue, moi j'aimerais passer rapidement sur le marché de la drogue de 60 hectares, qui est à la fois un marché pour les cannabis et également les drogues dures. Donc, je vais être un peu plus vite parce que les temps passent. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. D'accord. Nous avons la confirmation donc que 67 hectares est une ville là où il y a les stockages des drogues cannabis ou les drogues dures, mais également une zone de vente, là où on pourrait procurer les héroïnes ou les cocaïnes ou les autres drogues, comme le méthamphétamine, mais là, c'est pas assez, où il n'y a pas beaucoup. C'est un endroit de consommation également. Nous avons pu identifier 6 restaurants-bars, là où ils possèdent ce qu'on appelle les ghettos, un petit maisonnette ou un petit chalet à l'intérieur ou sur le toit des bars et des restaurants, là où on fait les injections ou là où on prend de la drogue. C'est une zone où on blanchit également l'argent de la drogue et un endroit où les trafiquants agissent en couverture, mais également un endroit où la corruption par rapport à la drogue existe également du fait qu'il est difficile d'arrêter les trafiquants. Et donc, c'est pour la cannabis et le drogue dur. On constate que c'est 2 marchés différents, des acteurs différents, des modes opératoires différents, mais c'est au niveau du dealer qu'on a constaté qu'il y a des dealers qui font à la fois la business en même temps. Prochain slide, s'il vous plaît. Le mode opératoire. Est-ce qu'on peut passer à la prochaine présentation? Oui. Donc, c'est comment ils fonctionnent les trafiquants aux 67 hectares. C'est que les grands patrons, ils font les commandes à l'extérieur et les dealers contactent les boss directement par téléphone ou par des rencontres interposées. Puis, les dealers et les consommateurs se voient directement ou s'appellent par téléphone et il a les livraisons dans un hôtel ou à la maison des consommateurs par rapport à leur statut social et leur statut financier. Et pour les cannabis, c'est un marché qui n'agisse pas vraiment dans l'indiscrétion. Donc, il y a un grossiste qu'on a identifié qui agisse depuis une trentaine d'années. C'est une famille très connue à Madagascar. Et les dealers ainsi que les consommateurs. Et la dernière présentation, c'est par rapport au prix. Julia et Lucia ont parlé des prix tout à l'heure avec les détails. Mais pour les marchés des drogues dures en arrive, c'est très varié. C'est très varié et instable. Et ça dépend également des dealers ou des fournisseurs. Donc, leur mode de paiement, c'est on paye les drogues en cash, mais il y a également des dealers qui font des ventes à crédit, soit ils ont des liens directs et des liens de confiance, les consommateurs et les dealers, soit les dealers eux-mêmes fournissent des drogues à des consommateurs pour que ces derniers font des ventes également. Donc, c'est un marché, donc en résumé, le marché des drogues dures et de cannabis à Madagascar, c'est un marché qui évolue et qui constitue un danger, vraiment, un danger en permanent et un danger qui mérite l'attention particulière des autorités malgaches, notamment des forces de l'ordre et les autres acteurs de lutte contre le trafic des drogues. Donc, c'est la fin de ma présentation. Je m'excuse pour le temps que j'ai pris, qui a passé au-delà, mais je vous remercie de votre attention.
Thanks, Brianna.
Donc, c'est à toi, Lindy,
Lucia and I will now continue on to wrap up the presentations and draw out some commonalities that we've seen across the island states. So clearly Rihanna and Vel have just been through the specifics of how drug networks and how the political economy of drug markets operates in Mauritius and Madagascar specifically. But I'd just like to zoom out slightly to compare what we see as the differences between how drug networks operate in the island states as a whole. And one major point that we drew out is that we see the stability of power dynamics in these drug markets varying significantly between the island states. So as Rihanna has just been through for Madagascar, as she highlighted in the slides of her presentation, which showed the large supplier at the top of the chain leading down to eventually the consumer of those drugs. What we see there is that there's a small number reportedly of major traffickers who are based primarily in Antananarivo, who have been in control of that market for seemingly a very long time. So it's quite a stable market where power is consolidated and networks of protection and corrupt links to law enforcement are established, links to overseas suppliers, and so on. This small group, in a sense, may number as low as 5 people. That's what a number that was bandied around, which obviously it's very, very difficult to establish that for certain, but just as a ballpark figure of how much power is concentrated in this market. And then these people will supply internationally and also service lower level domestic distribution networks in Madagascar. But then that also contrasts to our findings from the Seychelles, which also reported that a small number of people may coordinate imports of large-scale heroin imports into the Seychelles itself. So on that level, it was quite similar. But then also, as the heroin market has grown so rapidly in the Seychelles over the last 10 years or so, for domestic distribution, there have been a lot of new entrants and new players into the market who have been able to buy into that and then to profit significantly from it. So while there's a similar level of stability to Madagascar, at the higher levels, there was more flux kind of lower down, and especially for local area distribution. And similar dynamics to that were reported to us in the Comoros, which goes into more detail in the report. As Lucia and Vel have obviously already touched on somewhat for Mauritius, this is quite a different dynamic in that there is a very long established heroin market there, and there have been major players who have been operating in the heroin market for a very long time and also continuing to do that whilst some of them have been actually doing so from prison whilst in Mauritius. And that was a very established dynamic, but then in the last few years, as the synthetic cannabinoids market has really boomed, then that has disrupted the market by allowing new people to come into it and to capitalize on the large profits that are offered by synthetic cannabinoids. So that's disrupted the market slightly, but not necessarily to displace the previous networks who are controlling heroin distribution. It's more that the consumption population has expanded, and these new networks have been able to operate in parallel and in competition with those ones that were already there in Mauritius. So the situation is far more disrupted and fragmented than anything we've seen in the other markets. One common factor between them all, however, is something that we saw, which is a notable lack of violence reported connected to drug markets in the Indian Ocean, far less than we'd seen in comparative situations where the global initiative works in Eastern and Southern Africa. The notable exception to this is, as Rihanna highlighted for her discussion of the cannabis market in Madagascar, that groups within the cannabis producing regions in Madagascar trading in firearms and also being connected to violent confrontation with law enforcement in those regions. That is actually the only major exception that we've seen to this low violence trend for the rest of the island states. And the reasons behind that are something that we can look into further, open speculation, and is something perhaps to dig into in future work. Pass over to Lucia.
So turning to the governance and corruption implications of the drug markets across the islands, which I can see is something that we've already had some questions on, and I'll try and address those questions now. So our research found that corruption was the single most significant facilitating factor for drug markets and their growth across the islands. although to a notably lesser extent in the French overseas territories of Mayotte and Réunion. In the Comores, the Qaids, the high-level bosses who provide protection to networks, are widely recognized to be embedded in criminal justice and political institutions. And in Madagascar, well-established protection structures that support the long-standing environmental markets are in many cases being leveraged to protect the drugs markets. And we had interviewees cite a whole range of corrupt practices in connection with drugs markets. But a key difference between the islands is that in Madagascar and the Comores, drugs were perceived to be one of several illicit markets facilitated by corrupt elements of state institutions. This contrasts to the situations in the Seychelles and Mauritius, both of which rank very highly on global governance indices, where drugs stand out as the major illicit economy, and it means that the drugs market operates as a key driver of corruption. In both Mauritius and the Seychelles, law enforcement was reported to be significantly affected by corruption, particularly the specialist units tasked with spearheading the response. In Mauritius, the findings published in 2018 of the Constitutional Commission of Inquiry really emphasized that the drugs market was protected by pervasive corruption across state infrastructure. Our research very much supported these findings, with interviewees repeatedly citing further entrenchment of corruption since the 2018 report. Specifically, interviewees pointed to the upsurge in the drugs market since 2015, which is in parallel to the current administration taking power, but also to the significant emergence of synthetic cannabinoids, together with a perceived lack of action following the 2018 Commission report, as evidence of a lack of political will to address the growing drugs problem. And interviewees really reported feeling a broad sense of governance decay, and cited the 2019 elections in Mauritius, which were marred by procedural irregularities, marking a significant shift away from precedent, as an example of this. And this is explored much further in the report. Turning to the Seychelles, interviewees reported not only significant corruption, but a growing brazenness of corrupt practices. So, for example, bribes being paid to law enforcement to evade arrest, and consistently pointed to high-level protection. There has, of course, been a significant change of administration in Seychelles in late 2020, with the opposition party coming to power on partly an anti-corruption ticket. So this may be a key opportunity to address this. We have explored the impact of the change in administration on perceptions of corruption in the Seychelles in a recent risk bulletin published, which focused on the Western Indian Ocean Islands, posted earlier above in the chat. So please do go and explore a little further or ask us more questions on this. As one of the questions noted, while a lot of the money laundering linked to the drugs markets is based in cash, when you're talking of large volumes, at some point you require an injection into the formal financial systems. And it's interesting that in 2020, the financial systems of both Mauritius and the Seychelles, which have significant offshore financial centers, were downgraded in international rankings due to weaknesses in anti-money laundering systems. And in both countries, the drugs markets were identified as a key money laundering risk in assessments by the international financial regulatory bodies before the downgrade. So there does appear to be a link here, and it's definitely true that the financial systems are used to launder funds in this way. It's really worth emphasizing that both the governance implications of the drugs market and the absolutely crucial role of corruption in enabling the entrenchment and growth of the drugs market is an absolutely pivotal finding in our research. Julia, I'll turn over to you.
Thanks, Isa. So to move on slightly to discussing how the island states have responded to drugs markets as we've discussed them. As we've kind of wanted to show by highlighting the growing and diversifying use of drugs and trafficking of drugs through the region, and the social and economic and governance impacts which drugs markets have had across the islands. It does seem that the responses to drugs markets which are currently being enacted in the island states are not having the desired effect of which the policy approaches are aiming for. To take supply side responses first, In terms of intercepting drug trafficking shipments to the island states, in the Western Indian Ocean, there is both the island states' domestic operations to do so and regional and international cooperation efforts to counter maritime trafficking in the region, which both play a role here. And most prominent among this latter category is a multilateral task force known as Combined Task Force 150, which is a coalition of nations doing naval patrols in the Western Indian Ocean on a counter-piracy and counter-trafficking mandate. So this is the most prominent example of a regional cooperation mechanism at work here. So they operate in the Western Indian Ocean and face practical and legal challenges in countering these trafficking routes. Practical sense is that they are involved in policing a hugely vast area of the Western Indian Ocean. It's one of the most transited maritime corridors in the world, and drugs shipments obviously passing on vessels which may seek to avoid and evade monitoring systems and ability to track what vessels are passing through this region. They also face the legal challenge of when seizures are made in international waters that do not have the legal authority to seize a vessel, arrest and prosecute, meaning that even when drug seizures are made, it just means that drug shipments are destroyed and it's not possible to do a legal follow-up to that, meaning that there's no investigation of the networks involved and countering those trafficking routes. But going domestically, so the islands face different challenges to doing these sorts of interdictions. So particularly in Madagascar and the Comores, for example, interviewees highlighted a lack of capacity and resources to mount an effective response to countering trafficking. In particular in Madagascar, an example was given to us of a naval detachment in Nosy Bay, so the island in the north, which we highlighted as a key drugs hotspot. And there is one vessel available to the naval detachment there, which actually is not currently often able to be operational due to costs involved in running that vessel. So there are kind of practical challenges available to particularly Madagascar and the Comores in that sense. We go over this in more detail in the reports, but I'd like to move on slightly to doing looking at harm reduction responses and health-based approaches to drug policy in the island states. So to take Madagascar as a first example, the Malagasy government's approach is really skewed towards supply reduction responses, even though, as I've just discussed, they do have practical challenges in doing that. That actually harm reduction and health-based responses to drug use to support people who use drugs are not widely practiced in Madagascar. And while consumption is lower than seen in some of the other island states, such as Seychelles and Mauritius, the fact that there aren't those infrastructure available to support people who use drugs is perhaps a cause of concern, especially as use of drugs such as heroin is rising. To go instead to Mauritius and the Seychelles, both these countries have in the past years done a pivot towards a much more harm reduction based and health based response to the drugs markets, but they still also do rely on criminalization of drug use and drug possession as part of their response. So take Mauritius, for example, back in 2006, they began a pioneering policy approach addressing the health impacts of drug use, which included needle exchange, opioid substitution programs, and so on. Seychelles followed suit about a decade later. In 2016, they introduced a new Misuse of Drugs Act, which was a significant shift towards a public health-oriented response to drugs, and introduced, for example, a very large-scale methadone program designed at supporting the ever-growing and very large heroin-using population in the Seychelles. But again, in both, drug possession and use still remains criminalized. Looking at Mauritius, for example, arrests have risen sharply since 2015 on drug-related offences, of which a very, very high proportion has been for either possession or use rather than for trafficking-related offences. So to take 2019, that's 92% of convictions for drug offences were for either possession or use, which suggests that the law enforcement response is still skewed towards criminalising and penalising people who use drugs rather than oriented towards dealing with the networks who are trafficking in those drugs. And people who use drugs that we spoke to in the course of this research did report stigmatization and abuse on the part of law enforcement in both the Mauritius and the Seychelles, and wider in the islands as well. So that exacerbates the social and health impacts of these drug markets as well, and will undermine in a way the very policy aims of those same governments. So and in the Seychelles, actually, just to highlight one thing, is that since the new administration came in around 6 months ago, that's something that people who use drugs, who spoke to us in the course of our research, also reported that stigmatization and targeting by law enforcement to them had actually increased. So that's perhaps a trend which is going in the direction in a direction of more war on drugs approach back in the Seychelles. So in a sense, then we would see that both combining both criminalisation into that will perhaps undermine the health benefits of a more harm reduction approach as taken in both Mauritius and the Seychelles. But yes, overall, in summary, that we would say that the impact of these drug markets are mounting up, despite what these responses really are aiming to achieve. So I'll pass back to Lucia.
Thank you. Claudia, slide please. Turning to recommendations and drawing on the over 200 interviews that we conducted across the region and beyond, we conclude the report with a number of recommendations, including the 5 highlighted on the slide. We are running a bit short of time. I want to ensure that there's time for Q&A, so I won't go through them all and instead point you towards the report. I will just highlight one theme that has come out throughout the presentations, which is that approaches that decriminalise the use of drugs could be one tool in enabling the reduction of the harms that are being caused by these drugs markets and ensuring that resources are focused on networks that are perpetrating the greatest harm. Thank you very much. Lindy, over to you for the Q&A, and thank you, Claudia. We can end the slideshow.
Thank you so much, Lucia and Julia, and of course our other 2 speakers, Vel and Rihanna. Thank you so much to all of you for your presentations. We are, of course, running over time, and we do apologize for that. We will continue this conversation at least for the next 20 minutes, so I hope you do stay with us. Let's get straight into the Q&A session. I have grouped the questions so that we can try and get through as many as possible. In terms of the groupings, I'm going to start with transshipments. There are 2 major issues that have been raised here, coming from Timothy Walker and Brad Ings, as well as Rafael Moreto. The 2 main issues here, firstly, are related to how it is that Madagascar has come to have such a prominent role as a trafficking hub. Timothy asked whether or not this is related to conflict in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province, and if at all, that whether or not greater security in Cabo Delgado could see these drug routes returning to land in Mozambique. The other issue raised here is with regards to flag states appearing in the region. A question from Rafael concerning whether or not South American networks have been mapped in this region, or maritime ship flags being mapped from Southern and Western Africa. I think I'll pose those questions to Julia and Lucia.
Thank you, Lindy. I'll jump in first. So, in terms of the emergence of Madagascar as a key transshipment point, as we highlighted, the significant demand in Mauritius and the Seychelles is one factor. And it does seem that the kind of gradual displacement of landing points on the east and southern African coastline, both by increased law enforcement operations in certain areas, and also the displacement from northern Mozambique by the insurgency, is another factor contributing to the emergence of Madagascar as this transshipment hub. We're not suggesting that the displacement from northern Mozambique has all gone into landings in Madagascar. A significant portion has been displaced further south in the country, but the combination of insecurity and law enforcement seizures, we believe, is one factor leading to the acceleration of Madagascar emerging as a transshipment hub. We do explore the impacts of the insurgency in a previous Risk Bulletin edition, which we will share in the chat, so do have a look for further details. In terms of the flag states, it's a very good question. This is something that we would need to look into this more, and that we don't have much information at the moment. In terms of the Latin American networks, of course, these would be more prevalent for the cocaine trafficking. We have a recent or shortly to come report focusing on cocaine trafficking across the region that really dives into this in greater detail. But it's certainly true that as we're seeing East and Southern Africa as a whole being used more as a transshipment point for cocaine, the kind of influence of Latin American networks does look set to increase. Thank you, Lindy.
Great, thank you so much, Lucia. So again, in the interest of time, I'm going to group all the questions related to corruption. I know Lucia and Julia have addressed some elements of this already, but perhaps we can direct these particular questions to Vel and Rihanna. So Ahmed Khan is asking about the type of drug-fueled corruption on Mauritian politics. Sanjeev Narayanan was asking about the complicity of high-level public officials in the illicit drug trade, also referring specifically to Mauritius. From Madagascar, there's a question from a representative from law enforcement forces in the Anserabe region of Madagascar, Serge, saying that one of the main challenges is that big bosses are almost never arrested or quickly freed from jail. Even if criminals are arrested or incarcerated, some major challenges remain. And so in posing this question then to Vel and Rihanna, perhaps you can answer it from the perspective of investigative journalists. How is it that you use the media to expose the link between the illicit drug markets and corruption, even at very high levels? And of course, how it is that you name and shame big bosses, and the extent to which having a degree of media freedom allows you to tackle some of the biggest problems in the illicit drug trade?
Merci, Lindy. Il n'y a pas de preuves spécifiquement par rapport à la corruption de, disons, des politiciens ou des personnes occupant de postes à haute responsabilité. Certes, il y a eu des cas de corruption de douaniers, de dockers, etc. Mais il y a toujours la perception qu'il y a toujours un big boss, un plus gros poisson qui tire les ficelles. Mais récemment, avec les enquêtes qui sont menées par la commission anticorruption, on voit qu'il y a un phénomène assez nouveau. D'ailleurs, un monsieur a été condamné récemment. C'est que vous avez des groupes de commerçants qui financent le trafic de drogue. C'est que, voilà, vous mettez 100 000 roupies sur la table et vous recevez, disons, 500 000 en retour. C'est davantage un pseudo-Ponzi scheme, une chaîne de Ponzi. Donc, vous mettez 100 000 roupies et vous recevez 500 000 à 800 000. Et quand on voit les réseaux qui sont actifs, on se pose la question de savoir est-ce qu'il y a réellement quelqu'un qui est derrière, qui tire les ficelles, ou si ce sont eux-mêmes qui s'arrangent pour se faire voir près des politiciens. Nous avons eu des cas où, quand je parlais du navire transporteur de bétail, le principal suspect mauricien qui devait récupérer la drogue au port, etc., ben, sur sa page Facebook, vous le voyez avec un membre du gouvernement. Mais c'est ce que ça veut dire qu'ils sont liés, on ne sait pas. Quand vous dites name and shame, etc., en tant que journaliste responsable, on ne peut pas, sur des simples suppositions ou par rapport à une photo qui a été publiée, dire que voilà, un tel est lié à l'autre. Il y a certains journaux qui le font, qui disent voilà, il semble que M. X est lié à tel trafiquant. Mais si vous êtes responsable, il faut avoir des preuves. Si on a effectivement des preuves, ben, il n'y a aucune raison pour ne pas aller dire, voilà, un tel est lié à tel politicien ou tel politicien est financé par tel caïd. Mais jusqu'ici, on n'a pas ces preuves-là. C'est vrai, on dit souvent, il n'y a pas de fumée sans feu, mais tout repose sur des preuves. Parce que demain, lorsqu'il va vous poursuivre au civil pour diffamation, qu'est-ce que vous allez dire? J'ai entendu dire que X est lié à l'autre. Donc, il faut vraiment avoir cet élément de preuve pour savoir, voilà, est-ce que ce politicien savait que l'argent qu'il recevait pour sa campagne électorale est dérivé de la vente de drogue? Ou est-ce qu'il a reçu une BMW en cadeau de ce trafiquant en particulier? Donc, tout n'est pas aussi visible, quoi. Parce que si effectivement un trafiquant de drogue est en train de financer un politicien, ben, il va venir avec un sac plein de cash. Il va le laisser, qui va savoir? D'ailleurs, la grosse question ici, le grand débat, c'est par rapport au financement des partis politiques, parce que c'est assez opaque. Vous avez des leaders qui s'accrochent à leur poste, à leur rôle, parce que c'est un peu le nerf de la guerre. Parce que quand vous êtes le leader d'un parti politique, ben, vous serez les donations. Et comme il n'y a rien dans la loi par rapport aux donations des partis politiques, ben, il y a quelques années, un chef de parti, on a découvert 200 millions de roupies dans son coffre-fort, alors que la loi dit que vous ne devez pas avoir du cash chez vous. C'est comme ça. Merci, Lindy.
Yes, my apologies. Can we come to Rihanna for the Madagascar perspective on some of those issues mentioned between the relationship between corruption and illicit drug markets in Madagascar?
Donc, c'est un peu plus pareil pour le cas de mon confrère. Là. Le problème pour la preuve des corruptions, c'est le fait que ça se passe, au-delà de ce qu'on veut, ça se passe au-delà de ce qu'on a vu, mais c'est plutôt de ce qu'on entend. Mais quand même, il y a des faits concrets qui justifie l'implication de certains agents de l'État ou de la justice ou des forces de l'ordre, du fait qu'on sait pertinemment que les trafics existent. On sait pertinemment que la culture existe et le transport existe dans tel endroit et à tel endroit, mais comment se fait-il qu'il n'y a pas d'arrestation et comment se fait-il qu'il n'y a pas de saisie? Là, ce sont des faits concrets qui nous amènent à déduire qu'il y a quelque chose. Il y a cette entente payante, évidemment, du fait qu'on essaie d'être aveugle face aux faits. Ou également, il y a récemment, l'année dernière, il y a un tam-tam, il y a eu une grande médiatisation d'envergure nationale qu'on a arrêté un tel trafiquant. Et de plus, c'est quelqu'un, le numéro 1, on peut dire même que le numéro 1 à Madagascar, dans les trafics des drogues dures, a été arrêté. Mais un an après, il n'y a pas de procès. Et à la dernière information qu'on a, cette personne n'est plus à la prison. Donc, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Donc, c'est toute une autre investigation qui mérite d'être soulevée, en fait. Mais pour dire que ces trafiquants-là, c'est presque intouchable. Et ça répond et ça revient aux remarques de Cherche, de la mairie d'Antiala. Pourquoi il n'y a pas de gros poissons? Pourquoi on n'arrête que des petits poissons? Mais si on arrête de temps en temps, souvent les boss, mais ce sont des gens intouchables. Ils ont ces réseaux. Comme les acteurs de lutte, vous avez votre réseau, votre organisation, mais les trafiquants à Madagascar aussi, ils en ont. Et ils sont plus équipés même que les forces de l'ordre. Donc, c'est la question de corruption, ça existe, mais au niveau des collectes de preuves qui nous manquent. Et vous avez dit en d'investigation, comment allez-vous pour dénoncer tout ça? Donc, là, par exemple, ce qu'on a fait là, c'est une opportunité qui nous permet de publier les résultats de nos enquêtes, mais vu à Madagascar, la plupart des patrons de presse, ce sont des politiciens, ce sont des opérateurs économiques qui ont des intérêts à défendre et ils ont également un réseau. Ils sont en réseau avec les autorités. Donc, c'est parfois, on est limité. Mais comment on fait, c'est on essaie de trouver donc des plateformes à l'extérieur du pays qui nous permettent de publier les résultats de nos enquêtes. Mais pour l'instant, si c'est à Madagascar, ou je crois que c'est dans tant d'autres pays d'Afrique, par rapport au contexte politique, économique et social des journalistes, c'est plus ou moins difficile, quoi. Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I'm going to try and just touch on some questions regarding synthetic cannabinoids, financial flows, and decriminalization. So I'll open this to the floor, and those who would like to answer from our panel can just address the question that they feel suits them best. With regards to synthetic cannabinoids, a question from Ahmad Khan relating to Mauritius. He states that drug-related violence is low because traffickers don't want to attract attention. However, with the change in the drug markets in Mauritius, with the entry of synthetic cannabinoids, does the panel see a danger of this consensus of keeping things peaceful falling apart, given that now we see the emergence of a less centralized, less coordinated drug market around synthetic cannabinoids? And another on that same topic is asking about are authorities deliberately ignoring the trade in some ways in Mauritius, provided it is for export only? A question when it comes to financial flows from Ranjit. He says, we often read in the press that millions or even billions worth of drugs seized by authorities, but we never know how such transactions were financed. Kindly shed light on the financing part of drug dealing. And I do want to just pose one last question with regards to responses. Sorry about this, give me 1 second. Oh, here we go. Can the panel comment on the issue of decriminalization of cannabis in Mauritius as a way to stem the flow of synthetic cannabinoids in the country? So that decriminalization question, of course, can go beyond synthetic cannabinoids, but Ahmed Khan has posted in relation to that drug. And yeah, feel free for anyone in the panel to address those questions.
Donc, Ahmed est un... I'm sorry.
Vel, why don't you jump in on the Mauritius points first, and then I'll follow you on from you.
Okay, thank you, Lucia. So, donc, Ahmed est un collègue, nous avons travaillé dans la même boîte à un moment donné. Donc, par rapport à la drogue synthétique, effectivement, on a vu qu'il y a une sorte de démocratisation dans la vente de cette drogue, parce qu'auparavant, si vous vouliez acheter de l'héroïne ou du cannabis, etc., ben, il y avait des coins particuliers, voire des personnes particulières, etc. Mais le fait que la drogue synthétique se vende à près de 2 € la dose, ce qui fait qu'il y a davantage de personnes, Ahmed a dû lire lui-même dans les journaux mauriciens, c'est que vous avez beaucoup de personnes, vous avez même des jeunes, des mineurs qui vendent de la drogue synthétique parce que c'est tellement accessible que même un collégien, ben, 100 roupies, n'importe qui peut l'acheter. Donc, Ahmed demandait de savoir est-ce que cette bonne entente entre les trafiquants, est-ce que ça peut exploser plus tard? Je ne le pense pas parce qu'il y a certainement un réseau qui irrigue Maurice avec cette drogue particulière. Il y a, je sais, une enquête qui est menée pour savoir qui sont derrière ce trafic chimique, comme disait Lucia, parce que à La Réunion, à Mayotte, c'est connu comme la chimique. Ici, à un moment donné, on s'était aperçu que du thé, les thés en paquet qu'on vendait, je crois qu'il est très populaire en Grande-Bretagne comme à Maurice, mais il y avait une pénurie. Pourquoi? Parce qu'ils utilisaient le thé comme support pour vaporiser et pour le revendre comme de la drogue. La drogue synthétique, quand elle arrive, elle est concentrée. Donc ici, il la mélange avec du thé et d'autres substances pour la revendre. Et sur ce point particulier, je ne vois pas, étant moi-même journaliste des faits divers, je n'ai pas vu de réelle violence entre les différents groupes qui sont engagés dans le trafic de drogue. Par exemple, à Rochebois, à la rue Alfred Bénard, au lieu d'Hypocosson, vous avez plusieurs groupes, démolition, Suicide Squad et autres, qui sont engagés dans le trafic de drogue. Donc, il y a une certaine entente parce que le truc, c'est qu'ils ne veulent pas attirer l'attention sur eux. Parce que s'il y a de la bagarre, vous allez effectivement voir des policiers qui vont débarquer. J'ai écouté Lucia tout à l'heure, elle disait que voilà, on a l'impression que dans certains quartiers, comme disait Raymond plus tôt, c'est que dans certaines régions, on a l'impression, tout le monde sait que voilà, il y a un gros trafic qui se déroule, mais on ne voit rien. Et vous avez la police qui vient, qui n'arrête que ceux qui sont en possession de la drogue, mais pas les vendeurs. Donc, ça aussi, ça pose des questions. Est-ce que cette équipe qui est basée là-bas, est-ce qu'elle fait bien son travail ou est-ce qu'elle ferme les yeux sur les trafiquants? Il y a aussi le fait que certains des trafiquants sont peut-être des informateurs de la police. C'est pour ça qu'ils ne sont pas arrêtés. Par rapport à l'autre question, en ce qu'il s'agit du cannabis, c'est vrai, il y a une commission d'enquête sur la drogue qui a suggéré que peut-être Maurice devrait songer à la dépénalisation du cannabis. Parce que je lisais les journaux la semaine dernière, vous avez un jeune qui a été condamné à 10 ans de prison pour avoir tué sa demi-sœur et sa belle-mère. Et quand vous voyez un suspect qui est arrêté avec, disons, 100 grammes de cannabis, il peut en prendre pour 30 ans de prison. Donc, vous voyez cette disparité. C'est vrai qu'on est assez harsh, assez dur sur les consommateurs de drogue. Peut-être on devrait songer
Thank you,
à
Val.
relancer cette politique.
We are almost out of time. Does anybody else want to add anything, Lucia? No.
Oh, I won't take very much time as we are almost finishing. On the violence point, I would just note we haven't seen a parallel increase in violence since synthetic cannabinoids kind of exploded across Mauritius in 2015. And perhaps it's because demand continues to outstrip supply. But I'll keep my comments brief to there. Thank you, Lindy.
Thank you so
and I
much.
would just say that, of course, we haven't been able to cover everything that is in the report. So if you haven't done so already, please do go and read it. And of course, feel free to shoot any questions our way after this event. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lucia. Also, thank you very much, Val. In fact, thank you to the whole panel for your presentations, for your sharing your insights and your research from this very important report. So a big thank you to Lucia Bird, Julia Stanyard, Vel Moonien, and Rihanna Raymond Radriana Resoa. We are at the end of today's program. Thank you so much for staying with us for a full hour and a half. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and found it illuminating. As Lucia mentioned, do find the full report on the Global Initiative's website. It also has been posted in this chat box, so you can find the download link there. Now, we haven't been able to cover everything in today's session, but you will find other interesting insights also contained in the Civil Society Observatory of Illicit Economies in East and Southern Africa's risk bulletin. A risk bulletin number 18 touches on some key issues that we weren't able to fully cover, like the impact of COVID-19 on drug markets in the region and the new administration in the Seychelles and its potential to address drug-related corruption. You'll find all of that there on the GI's website, globalinitiative.net. Do keep track of the GI's events page. We are actually having another webinar next week from the East and Southern Africa Observatory that is looking at illicit gold markets in East and Southern Africa. That is on the 8th of June. You will find the link to register for that event on the Global Initiative's website. As I mentioned a little earlier, I am the host of the GI's Africa and the Global Illicit Economy podcast. We have been producing podcasts on illicit flows, on illicit substances, and a range of very interesting topics for the past year. So you can go through that and have a look at some of the podcasts that we've put together covering the illicit economy around Africa. The next episode that's coming up quite soon is on North Africa and what might happen to the illicit economy in that region following the death of Idris Deby, the longtime president of Chad. Well, that is where we leave it for today. So once again, a big thank you to our panelists. A very special thank you also to our interpreters who've been providing us with both English and French language broadcasting of this webinar. From me and the entire GI team, thank you so much for participating in today's event, and we look forward to engaging with you again soon. Goodbye.